The hammering started at 7 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 3 months. William Chen pressed the chisel against the marble block, feeling the familiar resistance as he began another careful strike. The sound echoed. Across his backyard in Millbrook Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the loudest noise was usually Mrs. Patterson's ancient lawnmower on Saturday mornings. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. William had never intended to become the neighborhood's problem. When he'd moved into the modest 2-story house on Elm Street 18 months ago, he'd been drawn to the spacious backyard that stretched nearly a quarter acre behind the property. The previous owners had left behind a large wooden shed that most people would have used for garden tools or seasonal decorations. William saw something different entirely. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with small changes that seemed innocent enough. He'd reinforced the shed's foundation, expanded the electrical system, and installed proper ventilation. The neighbors barely noticed when he brought in the first few pieces of equipment. A pottery wheel that he'd inherited from his grandmother, some basic woodworking tools, and boxes of art supplies that had been collecting dust in his apartment. For years, it was Charlotte Morrison from next door who first expressed concern. She'd approached him one evening in late September as he was carrying in what looked like industrial equipment. The welder had been a significant investment, one that represented William's commitment to taking his metalwork seriously. Charlotte stood at the fence line, her arms crossed, watching as he maneuvered the heavy machine through his back door. "That looks pretty serious," she said, trying to keep her tone conversational. "Are you planning some kind of business back there?" William paused, setting down his end of the welder. He'd been expecting this conversation, though he'd hoped it would come later, after he'd had more time to establish himself as a considerate neighbor. "It's just a hobby," he explained. "I work with different materials: wood, metal, clay. Nothing too intensive." Charlotte nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. "It's just that we moved here for the quiet, you know? Henry and I, we both work from home now, and sound really carries between these houses." Henry Morrison appeared at their back door as if summoned by the mention of his name. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of precise posture that suggested years of corporate meetings. "Everything all right out here?" he called. "Just getting to know our neighbor," Charlotte replied, but her voice carried a note of tension that hadn't been there moments before. William understood their concern. Millbrook Heights was the kind of neighborhood where people paid premium prices for peace and predictability. The houses were well maintained, the lawns meticulously cared for, and the residents generally kept to themselves while maintaining a veneer of neighborly politeness. He represented something unknown, and unknown quantities made people nervous. "I'll keep the noise to reasonable hours," William promised. "Nothing before 8 in the morning or after 6 in the evening, and I'll try to keep it as quiet as possible even during those times." The Morrisons seemed satisfied with this arrangement, though William caught them glancing toward his backyard more frequently in the days that followed. He made good on his promise initially, limiting his work to short sessions and choosing projects that required minimal noise. But as autumn progressed and his confidence grew, the scope of his ambitions expanded. The trouble really began when William started working with stone. He discovered a quarry about an hour outside town that sold blocks of local limestone and imported marble at reasonable prices. The stone spoke to him in a way that other materials didn't. It had weight and permanence, a resistance that demanded respect and rewarded patience. But stone carving was loud work, and even with his best efforts to muffle the sound, the constant tapping and chiseling carried across the neighborhood like a persistent woodpecker. Amelia Rodriguez lived 3 houses down, and she was the first to formally complain. William found her business card in his mailbox on a Tuesday morning in early November. She was a real estate attorney, and the card was accompanied by a politely worded but unmistakably threatening note about noise ordinances and property values. I understand you're pursuing creative interests, the note read, but the continuous noise is disrupting the peaceful enjoyment of our homes. Please consider relocating these activities to a more appropriate venue, or we may need to explore other options. William sat on his front steps, reading the note a second time. He'd been so focused on the work itself that he'd failed to consider how his neighbors were experiencing it. The studio had become his sanctuary, the place where he could disappear, for hours at a time, losing himself in the meditative rhythm of creation. It hadn't occurred to him that what felt like peaceful focus to him might sound like industrial chaos to everyone else. That evening, he made a circuit of the immediate neighborhood, knocking on doors and attempting to gauge the extent of the problem. Most of his neighbors were polite but distant. They assured him that they understood his position while making it clear that they hoped he would find a solution soon. A few were more direct. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an elderly woman who lived alone in the house directly behind his, invited him in for coffee and spoke with the bluntness that came with age. "Honey, I don't care what you're doing back there, but it sounds like you're building Noah's Ark. My bridge group meets here every Thursday afternoon, and last week we couldn't hear ourselves think over all that banging." William apologized and explained his situation. He'd been laid off from his marketing job 6 months earlier, and while he searched for new employment, he'd been using the time to seriously pursue the artistic interest he'd neglected for years. The studio represented hope, a space where he could develop skills that might eventually provide income, or at least personal fulfillment during an uncertain time. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. "I can understand that, dear. But you've got to understand that people around here bought these houses expecting a certain kind of life. Quiet mornings, peaceful evenings. Your hammering starts before some folks have had their first cup of coffee." She was right, of course. William had become so absorbed in his own schedule that he'd lost sight of everyone else's. He returned home, that night determined to find a compromise that would allow him to continue his work without alienating his neighbors further. The soundproofing project became an obsession. William researched acoustic dampening materials, studied sound transmission principles, and spent his remaining savings on foam panels, mass-loaded vinyl, and specialized insulation. He worked through the weekends, transforming the interior of his studio into something that resembled a recording booth more than a traditional workshop. The modifications helped, but they didn't eliminate the problem entirely. Stone carving, by its very nature, involved percussive force that traveled through the ground as much as through the air. The neighbors might not hear the sharp crack of chisel against marble, but they could feel the subtle vibrations through their foundations. By December, the complaints had escalated. William received his first official notice from the city's code enforcement office, citing noise ordinance violations and requesting that he cease industrial activities in a residential zone. The letter was polite but firm, and it carried the weight of potential legal consequences. William met with the code enforcement officer, a middle-aged woman named Janet Stevens, who seemed genuinely sympathetic to his situation. She explained that the city had received multiple complaints over several weeks, and while she could see that he was making good faith efforts to address the noise, the complaints were continuing. "The thing is," Janet explained as they stood in his backyard studio, "this is a really impressive setup you've got here. But residential zoning has pretty strict limitations on what kinds of activities are permitted. If neighbors are complaining, and we can document noise violations, we have to act." She gave him 30 days to either soundproof the space to compliance levels or limit his activities to types of work that wouldn't generate complaints. It was a reasonable request, but William knew that truly effective soundproofing would cost thousands of dollars he didn't have. And limiting himself to quiet activities would essentially mean abandoning the stonework that had become his passion. That night, William sat in his studio surrounded by half-finished sculptures and the tools that had come to define his daily routine. The space felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a problem that needed solving. He'd invested everything he had into creating this workspace, not just financially, but emotionally. The idea of giving it up felt like admitting defeat in more ways than one. But as he looked around at the evidence of his progress, the gradually improving quality of his work, the growing confidence in his technique, the sense of purpose that had carried him through months of unemployment, William realized that the studio itself wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that he'd been working in isolation, pursuing his passion without considering how it affected the community around him. The neighbors weren't wrong to complain. They had every right to peaceful enjoyment of their homes. But William also had something valuable to offer, something that went beyond the noise and disruption. He just needed to find a way to help them see it. The solution, when it came to him, seemed so obvious that he wondered why he hadn't thought of it sooner. If the neighbors were going to be affected by his work regardless, perhaps they should be invited to be part of it, not as unwilling audience, members subjected to industrial sounds, but as participants in something beautiful being created in their midst. William began planning what would become the first of several open studio events, though he didn't know it at the time. He would invite the neighbors to see what all the noise had been about, to understand the process, and perhaps even try their hand at some of the simpler techniques. It was a risk, exposing his work to potential criticism from people who were already frustrated with him, but it felt like the only honest way forward. As winter settled over Millbrook Heights and the complaints continued to accumulate in his mailbox, William worked with renewed purpose. He was no longer just creating art for its own sake. He was creating something that would need to speak for itself, to justify the disruption it had caused, and to transform skeptical neighbors into something approaching allies. The marble block he'd been working on for the past month was beginning to reveal its secrets. What had started as an abstract exploration was becoming something recognizable, a figure emerging from stone, caught in a moment of transformation. William couldn't have known it then, but this piece would eventually become the centerpiece of his first museum exhibition, the work that would validate everything he'd been trying to accomplish in his backyard studio. But that vindication was still months away. For now, there was only the daily routine of creation, the persistent complaints from neighbors, and the growing certainty that something significant was taking shape in the converted shed behind his house on Elm Street. The first open studio event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in mid-January, but William's plans were derailed 3 days before, when he discovered something that changed everything. He'd been researching local art history for promotional materials when he stumbled across a newspaper article from 1987 that mentioned his address specifically. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The Millbrook Heights Gazette had run a feature story about the neighborhood's transformation from farmland to suburban development, and buried in the third paragraph was a single sentence that made William's heart race. The property at 247 Elm Street was once home to the workshop of renowned sculptor Marcus Whitfield, whose public installations can still be seen throughout the downtown district. William had never heard of Marcus Whitfield, but a quick internet search revealed an artist whose work had defined the aesthetic character of downtown Millbrook for decades. Whitfield's bronze sculptures stood in the courthouse plaza, outside, the library, and in the memorial garden behind City Hall. They were pieces that William had walked past countless times without really seeing them, part of the background fabric of the city's identity. The implications were staggering. William's studio, the source of so much neighborhood controversy, was built on the foundation of another artist's workshop. The shed he'd been renovating wasn't just a random outbuilding, it was the physical remnant of a creative space that had produced some of the city's most celebrated public art. William spent the rest of that evening diving deeper into Marcus Whitfield's story. The artist had purchased the property in 1962 when Millbrook Heights was still being developed. Back then, the lot had been twice its current size, extending well into what was now the Morrisons' backyard. Whitfield had built his workshop specifically to take advantage of the space and isolation, creating large-scale pieces that required both heavy equipment and room to work. The workshop had operated for nearly 25 years before Whitfield's death in 1986. According to the obituaries William found, the artist had been working on his largest commission ever, a monument for the state capitol, when he suffered a heart attack at his workbench. The property had been sold quickly by his estate, subdivided, and developed into the current neighborhood configuration. What fascinated William most was the description of Whitfield's working methods. Like William, he had been primarily a stone carver, though he also worked in bronze and other metals. The newspaper profiles described the constant sound of hammering and chiseling that emanated from the Elm Street workshop, the steady rhythm that had become part of the neighborhood's daily soundtrack. But there was something else in those old articles, something that gave William hope. The neighbors hadn't just tolerated Marcus Whitfield's work, they had celebrated it. There were quotes from residents who spoke proudly of living near such an accomplished artist, who bragged to friends about the famous sculptures being created, just down the street from their homes. The difference, William realized, was context. Whitfield's neighbors had understood what he was creating, because they could see the finished work displayed prominently throughout their city. They had a reference point, a way to connect the noise and disruption in their neighborhood to something beautiful and meaningful in their community. William's neighbors had no such context. To them, he was just the unemployed guy next door who made too much noise. They had no reason to believe that anything worthwhile was coming from all that hammering, because they'd never seen evidence of his artistic ability. This realization led William to make a radical decision. Instead of simply inviting neighbors to see his current work, he would research and present the complete history of the workshop space. He would help them understand that they weren't just living next to a hobbyist with delusions of grandeur. They were living next to the continuation of an artistic legacy that had been part of their community for decades. The research became an obsession that consumed the next 2 weeks. William contacted the Millbrook Historical Society, which turned out to have an extensive collection of photographs and documents related to Marcus Whitfield's career. The Historical Society's director, an enthusiastic woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, was thrilled to meet someone who had taken an interest in Whitfield's work. Marcus was one of the most important artists this city has produced, Dr. Chen explained as she led William through the Society's archives. But so much of his work has become invisible to people. It's part of the landscape now, taken for granted. Most residents have no idea they're walking past museum-quality sculptures every day. The photographs were revelatory. They showed the original workshop at various stages of construction and use, revealing details that William hadn't been able to discern from his own renovation. He could see where Whitfield had installed specialized lifting equipment for moving heavy stone blocks, where he'd positioned his primary workbenches to take advantage of natural light, and how he'd organized the space for maximum efficiency. More importantly, the photographs showed the workshop in the context of the neighborhood's development. In the early images, Whitfield's property stood relatively isolated, surrounded by empty lots and construction sites. But as the years progressed, houses appeared in the background, and the photographs began to include neighbors who had stopped by to observe the work in progress. One photograph from 1978 showed Marcus Whitfield demonstrating stone carving techniques to a group of local children, their parents watching from a respectful distance. Another showed him consulting with city officials about the placement of a new sculpture, the workshop visible in the background with several neighbors gathered around to listen to the discussion. These weren't the interactions of a man at odds with his community. They were the interactions of someone who had found a way to make his work part of the neighborhood's identity, someone whose artistic practice had become a source of local pride rather than irritation. Chen also provided William with copies of Marcus Whitfield's original city permits and zoning applications. The documents revealed that Whitfield had gone through extensive legal processes to establish his workshop, working with city planners to ensure that his activities were properly classified and approved. He hadn't simply moved into a residential neighborhood and started making noise. He had worked within the system to create a space that served both his artistic needs and the community's interests. Armed with this information, William approached the city's current zoning office to understand how these historical precedents might apply to his own situation. The conversation with Janet Stevens took on an entirely different character. When William presented the documentation showing that his property had been continuously used for artistic purposes for decades. "This is fascinating," Janet said, reviewing the historical permits. "I had no idea about this history. The current zoning codes don't explicitly account for grandfathered artistic uses, but there's definitely precedent here for reconsidering your classification." Janet explained that William's situation was complicated by the fact that there had been a gap in artistic use of the property between Whitfield's death and William's arrival. The subdivision and sale had reset the property's classification to purely residential. However, the historical documentation provided grounds for requesting a special use permit that would formally recognize the workshop's unique status. The permit process would take months and would require community input, but it offered a legal path forward that didn't depend entirely on his neighbors' goodwill. More importantly, it provided a framework for the conversation William wanted to have with his community, not about whether his work should be allowed, but about how it could be integrated into the neighborhood in a way that honored both the property's history and the residents' quality of life. William decided to postpone his open studio event until he could present this broader context. Instead of simply asking neighbors to tolerate his hobby, he would invite them to become part of reviving an important piece of their neighborhood's cultural heritage. The story of Marcus Whitfield became the foundation for a presentation that William spent weeks preparing. He created a timeline of the workshop's history, complete with photographs and examples of Whitfield's public sculptures that his neighbors passed every day. He researched the current value of Whitfield's work. Pieces were selling at auction for tens of thousands of dollars, and documented the artist's influence on other regional sculptors. Most importantly, William began to understand his own work in the context of this legacy. The techniques he'd been developing through months of experimentation were variations on methods that Whitfield had pioneered decades earlier. The stone carving processes that seemed so disruptive to his neighbors were actually traditional crafts that had been practiced on this exact spot for a quarter of a century. This historical context also gave William new insight into his own artistic development. He began to see patterns in his work that connected to Whitfield's aesthetic sensibilities, influences that he'd absorbed unconsciously by working in the same space with similar materials and tools. The marble figure that was nearing completion in his studio bore an unmistakable resemblance to Whitfield's treatment of the human form, though William had never consciously studied the older artist's style. As February arrived and William prepared to reintroduce himself to his neighbors, he felt a confidence that had been missing from his earlier attempts at community engagement. He wasn't just a guy with a hobby anymore. He was the inheritor of an artistic tradition that had deep roots in their shared community. The letter he sent to each household in the immediate neighborhood was carefully crafted to emphasize discovery rather than justification. "I've recently learned something fascinating about our neighborhood that I think you'll find as interesting as I do," it began. "It turns out that the workshop behind my house has a remarkable history that connects to some of the most recognizable art in our city." The response was immediate and surprising. Charlotte Morrison called within hours of receiving the letter, her tone completely different from their previous conversations. "Henry and I have been wondering about those sculptures downtown for years," she said. "We had no idea they were created right here in the neighborhood. Would it be possible to see some of the historical materials you mentioned?" Similar calls came from other neighbors throughout the week. Even Amelia Rodriguez, whose legal training had made her the most formal in her complaints, expressed interest in learning more about the property's artistic heritage. Mrs. Patterson was particularly enthusiastic, remembering Marcus Whitfield. From her younger days and recalling the pride that residents had felt about having such an accomplished artist in their midst. The shift in neighborhood sentiment was palpable, but William knew that goodwill based on historical interest would only carry him so far. He still needed to demonstrate that his own work was worthy of the space's legacy, that he wasn't simply trading on Marcus Whitfield's reputation to justify his own amateur efforts. The marble sculpture that had been evolving in his studio for months would be his test case. If he could show his neighbors that he was creating something genuinely significant, something that honored both the property's history and their community's aesthetic standards, then perhaps they could find a way to coexist that served everyone's interests. As William put the finishing touches on his presentation materials, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with carrying on someone else's life work. Marcus Whitfield had built more than just a workshop behind the house on Elm Street. He had built a bridge between artistic creation and community life, a model for how individual passion could serve broader social purposes. Now it was William's turn to build that bridge anew, to prove that the sounds echoing from the converted she'd weren't just noise, but the rhythm of something valuable taking shape. The success or failure of this effort would determine not just his own future in Millbrook Heights, but the future of artistic practice in a space that had been devoted to creativity for more than half a century. The community meeting that William organized for the first Saturday in March turned out to be unlike anything Millbrook Heights had experienced in recent memory. What began as a simple presentation about the workshop's history evolved into something that resembled a neighborhood festival, complete with refreshments, live demonstrations, and an energy that surprised everyone involved. William had spent the previous week transforming his backyard into a proper venue for the event. He borrowed folding chairs from the community center, set up display boards with historical photographs and documentation, and arranged his studio space to allow small groups of visitors to observe his work process safely. The marble sculpture that had been occupying his attention for months was positioned prominently, draped with a cloth that would be removed for the formal unveiling. The first arrivals came early before the official start time. Mrs. Patterson appeared at his back gate wearing her best dress and carrying a covered casserole dish that she insisted on contributing to the refreshment table. "I remember when Marcus used to have people over," she explained. "There was always food involved. Artists get hungry and neighbors appreciate being fed." Henry Morrison arrived with a professional-quality camera, explaining that he'd become interested in documenting the event for potential submission to the Neighborhood Association newsletter. His wife, Charlotte, carried a notebook and seemed to be taking detailed notes about everything she observed. Their transformation from skeptical complainants to engaged participants was perhaps the most dramatic evidence of how completely the situation had changed. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Historical Society had agreed to attend as a guest speaker, bringing additional archival materials that weren't available in William's research. She set up a separate display area with items that had belonged to Marcus Whitfield personally, tools, sketches, and photographs that provided intimate glimpses into the original artist's creative process. "This is remarkable," Dr. Chen said as she surveyed William's studio setup. "You've managed to recreate not just the physical space, but something of the original atmosphere." Marcus would have recognized this environment immediately. The formal presentation began at 2 o'clock with nearly 30 people in attendance, far more than William had anticipated. Word had spread beyond the immediate neighbors to include residents from throughout Millbrook Heights, as well as several members of the city council who had heard about the historical discoveries through Janet Stevens in the zoning office. William opened with a timeline presentation that traced the property's artistic heritage from Marcus Whitfield's initial purchase through the present day. He'd prepared extensively, but found himself departing from his planned remarks as he became caught up in the enthusiasm of his audience. Questions and comments from neighbors led to impromptu discussions about specific Whitfield sculptures, memories of the original workshop's operation, and speculation about what the future might hold. "I walk past the courthouse sculpture every day on my way to work," said Tom Bradley, who lived 4 streets over. I never knew it came from right here in our neighborhood. That changes how I see it completely. Amelia Rodriguez, the real estate attorney whose legal threat had been one of William's first formal complaints, raised her hand during the question period. I've been thinking about the property value implications of this discovery, she said. Having a historically significant artist's workshop in the neighborhood, that's actually a selling point, not a liability. People pay premiums to live near cultural landmarks. The comment sparked a broader discussion about how the workshop's revival might affect the entire neighborhood's character and desirability. Several residents mentioned that they'd chosen Millbrook Heights, specifically because it felt like a community with history and character, rather than a generic suburban development. The idea that their neighborhood had genuine artistic heritage seemed to validate that choice in ways they hadn't expected. When William moved the group into his studio for the live demonstration portion of the event, the atmosphere became even more electric. He'd prepared a small block of soft limestone that would allow him to demonstrate basic carving techniques without the noise that had caused so many complaints. Working with hand tools only, he began to shape the stone while explaining his process and answering questions about technique, materials, and artistic decision-making. The sound that you've been hearing, William explained as he worked, isn't random hammering. Every strike of the chisel is deliberate, part of a conversation between the artist and the material. The stone tells you where it wants to be cut, and you have to listen carefully to hear what it's saying. Charlotte Morrison leaned forward to get a better view of his hands as he worked. I never realized how precise it had to be, she said. From our house, it just sounds like construction work. But watching you do it, I can see that it's actually quite delicate. The demonstration continued for nearly an hour, with neighbors taking turns asking questions and observing the gradual transformation of the limestone block. William found himself energized by their interest, explaining not just the mechanical aspects of stone carving, but the meditative qualities that made the work so compelling for him personally. When I'm working, he said, pausing to brush stone, dust from the emerging form, I lose track of time completely. Hours can pass without me realizing it. That's why I sometimes don't notice how early I'm starting or how long I've been at it. The work creates its own rhythm, its own sense of time. Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. Marcus was the same way. I used to see him working in here at all hours, completely absorbed. Sometimes I'd wave from my kitchen window and he wouldn't even notice. The historical connection became even more tangible when Dr. Chen brought out several of Marcus Whitfield's original tools, implements that had been donated to the Historical Society by his estate. William handled them with reverence, noting how the wear patterns on the metal revealed decades of use, how the handles had been shaped by countless hours of gripping and striking. These tools are still perfectly functional, Dr. Chen explained. Stone carving techniques haven't changed, fundamentally in centuries. The same methods that Marcus used are the same ones that William is using today. At Charlotte's suggestion, William tried working with one of Whitfield's original chisels, a heavy tool with a distinctive angled edge that created a particular texture in the stone. The moment felt ceremonial, a literal passing of implements from one generation of artists to the next. Several neighbors took photographs of the exchange, sensing that they were witnessing something historically significant. The unveiling of William's completed marble sculpture provided the afternoon's emotional climax. He'd been working on the piece for months, and it represented his most ambitious effort to date, a life-sized figure caught in a moment of emergence, as if stepping out of the stone itself. The technical execution was sophisticated, but what struck the audience most forcefully was the sculpture's emotional resonance. It's beautiful, Charlotte said quietly, and her comment seemed to speak for the entire group. The sculpture possessed a quality that transcended technical skill, something that spoke to universal experiences of transformation and becoming. Henry Morrison circled the piece slowly, taking photographs from multiple angles. This isn't amateur work, he said finally. This is professional-level art. I had no idea you were creating something like this. The comment opened a broader discussion about artistic recognition and the challenges that contemporary artists faced in gaining recognition for their work. Several neighbors expressed surprise that someone capable of creating such sophisticated art was working in relative obscurity, unknown to the broader community despite living in their midst. "This is exactly what happened with Marcus," Mrs. Patterson observed. "People didn't really understand what he was doing until his work started appearing in public spaces around the city. Then suddenly, everyone was proud to have him as a neighbor." The parallel wasn't lost on anyone present. William's situation mirrored Whitfield's early career, when the artist had been working in isolation, developing his skills and creating significant work that hadn't yet found its proper audience. The difference was that William's neighbors now had the benefit of historical perspective, understanding how artistic development worked and what kind of long-term value it could bring to their community. As the afternoon progressed, the gathering took on increasingly collaborative qualities. Neighbors began discussing practical solutions to the noise issues that had originally sparked the complaints. Tom Bradley, who worked in construction, offered suggestions for additional soundproofing techniques that might be more effective than William's current setup. Amelia Rodriguez volunteered to help with the special use permit application, using her legal expertise to navigate the zoning process more efficiently. Most significantly, the group began to envision ways that the workshop could become a genuine community resource rather than simply a private studio. Charlotte Morrison suggested that William might offer occasional classes or demonstrations for interested neighbors. Mrs. Patterson wondered whether the space might host small exhibitions of local artists' work, creating a venue for cultural activities that the neighborhood currently lacked. "What if we made this into something like Marcus's workshop in its heyday?" suggested Dr. Chen. "A place where art is created, but also where the community can engage with the creative process directly." The idea sparked immediate enthusiasm. Several neighbors volunteered to help with various aspects of such an initiative, from managing logistics to promoting events to providing refreshments for gatherings. What had begun as a meeting to address complaints was transforming into a planning session for collaborative cultural programming. William found himself simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed by the response. The support was more than he had dared to hope for, but it also represented responsibilities that he hadn't anticipated. His neighbors weren't just offering to tolerate his work, they were asking to become partners in it, to help shape its development, and ensure its integration into the community's ongoing life. As the event wound down in the early evening, William stood in his backyard surrounded by the evidence of the day's success. Empty refreshment tables, folding chairs arranged in conversational clusters, and neighbors lingering in small groups to continue discussions that had begun during the formal presentation. The transformation felt almost magical, as if the space had been returned to its original purpose after years of dormancy. The last to leave were the Morrisons, who stayed behind to help William pack up the display materials and return the borrowed furniture to storage. As they worked, Charlotte reflected on how dramatically her perspective had changed over the course of a single afternoon. "I owe you an apology," she said. "We were so focused on the noise that we never bothered to find out what was creating it. If we'd known what you were actually doing, none of this conflict would have been necessary." William shook his head. "You were right to be concerned about the noise. I was so caught up in the work that I didn't consider how it was affecting everyone else. This whole process has taught me that art doesn't exist in isolation. It's always part of a larger community, whether we acknowledge that or not." As his neighbors finally departed and William stood alone in his backyard, he felt a profound shift in his relationship to both his work and his community. The studio was no longer a refuge from the world around him. It had become a bridge connecting him to neighbors who were now invested in his success and eager to support his artistic development. The marble sculpture stood in the center of the workspace, no longer hidden but proudly displayed, ready to be seen by anyone who chose to visit. William realized that this openness, this willingness to make his creative process visible and accessible, would fundamentally change how he approached his art going forward. But he had no way of knowing that within weeks, this sculpture would catch the attention of someone whose opinion would change everything, someone whose recognition would transform William from a neighborhood curiosity into a serious contender for major artistic opportunities. The seeds of that recognition had been planted during the afternoon's gathering, though none of the participants could have predicted how quickly and dramatically they would grow. 3 weeks after the community gathering, William was deep into his morning routine when he heard an unfamiliar voice calling from his back gate. It was barely past 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, and he'd been working since dawn on a new piece, a companion sculpture to the marble figure that had garnered so much attention from his neighbors. The sound of someone approaching interrupted his concentration, but he'd grown accustomed to occasional visitors since word of the workshop's revival had spread throughout Millbrook Heights. What he wasn't prepared for was the woman who stood at his gate, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a charcoal wool coat despite the warming March weather. She carried herself with the kind of composed authority that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously, and her keen eyes were already scanning the visible portions of his workspace with professional interest. "Mr. Chen?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "My name is Margaret Thorne. I'm the director of the Millbrook Contemporary Arts Center. I was hoping we might have a conversation about your work." William set down his chisel, suddenly conscious of the stone dust covering his clothes and hands. The Millbrook Contemporary Arts Center was the city's premier cultural institution, a showcase for regional and national artists that William had visited numerous times, but never imagined might take interest in his own work. Margaret Thorne's reputation preceded her. She was known throughout the art world for her discerning eye and her ability to identify significant talent before it achieved widespread recognition. "Of course," William managed, fumbling with the gate latch. "Please come in, though I should warn you it's quite a mess back here." Margaret Thorne smiled, the expression transforming her austere features. "Mr. Chen, I've visited artists' studios around the world. Mess is often a sign that real work is happening." As she entered the workspace, her gaze immediately went to the marble sculpture that had been the centerpiece of the community event. She approached it slowly, walking around the piece and examining it from multiple angles. Her silence stretched long enough to make William uncomfortable, but he resisted the urge to fill the quiet with nervous chatter. "Remarkable," she said, finally. "The technical execution is sophisticated, but what strikes me most is the emotional honesty. This isn't work that's trying to impress anyone. It's work that has something genuine to say." She turned to examine the new piece William had been working on, a limestone carving that explored similar themes of emergence and transformation, but with a more abstract approach. The contrast between the two sculptures revealed the rapid evolution of his artistic vision, the way months of dedicated practice had refined both his technical skills and his conceptual clarity. "How long have you been working in stone?" Margaret asked, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the limestone piece. "Seriously? About 8 months," William replied. "I'd experimented with other materials before, but stone carving didn't really begin until I set up this workshop." Margaret raised an eyebrow. 8 months? That's unusual. Most sculptors take years to develop this level of facility with the medium. William found himself explaining the circumstances that had led to his artistic focus, the job loss that had provided time for intensive practice, the discovery of Marcus Whitfield's legacy, the way working in the same space seemed to connect him to techniques and sensibilities that he couldn't have learned from books or classes alone. "Ah, Marcus Whitfield," Margaret said, her expression shifting to one of keen interest. "I knew Marcus quite well, actually. The Art Center acquired several of his smaller pieces over the years, and I had many conversations with him about his work." "You're saying this is his original workshop?" The revelation that Margaret Thorne had known Marcus Whitfield personally added another layer of significance to her visit. As William showed her around the space, pointing out elements that had been part of the original setup and modifications he'd made for his own use, Margaret shared memories of visiting the workshop during its operational heyday. Marcus was incredibly generous with his time and knowledge, she recalled. He understood that art exists in community, that individual creativity flourishes when it's connected to broader cultural conversations. Some of my fondest memories of this place are from the gatherings he used to host. Artists, writers, musicians, all coming together to share ideas and inspiration. Margaret's stories painted a picture of the workshop as a genuine cultural hub, a place where creative energy had sparked collaborations and friendships that extended far beyond sculpture. The parallel to William's recent community event wasn't lost on either of them, and Margaret seemed particularly interested in hearing about the neighbors' response to learning about the property's artistic heritage. Community support is crucial for artists, she observed. But it's especially important when you're working at this scale, with these materials. Stone carving isn't something you can do quietly in a corner. It requires space, equipment, and tolerance for the inevitable. Noise and disruption. The fact that your neighbors have become advocates rather than obstacles suggests something significant about both your approach and the quality of what you're producing. As they talked, Margaret's attention kept returning to the marble sculpture. She examined details that William hadn't consciously planned but had emerged through the carving process. Subtle variations in texture that caught and reflected light, proportional relationships that created visual tension and resolution, surface treatments that invited touch while maintaining classical restraint. This piece has the quality that separates amateur work from professional art, she said. It's not just technically competent, it has presence. It commands attention and rewards careful observation. That's not something that can be taught. It has to come from genuine artistic instinct. Margaret's assessment was more validation than William had dared to hope for, but her next comment caught him completely off guard. I'm currently planning an exhibition for this fall that will focus on contemporary stone carving, she said. It's meant to highlight the revival of traditional sculptural techniques among younger artists, the way ancient crafts are finding new relevance in modern artistic practice. I think your work would be perfect for inclusion. William felt his heart rate accelerate. Exhibition at the Millbrook Contemporary Arts Center represented the kind of recognition that could transform an amateur enthusiast into a professional artist. It was the difference between being someone who made art as a hobby and someone whose work was taken seriously by the broader cultural community. That would be incredible, he managed. But I should probably mention that I don't have gallery representation or much of a portfolio beyond what you see here. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of exposure. Margaret waved away his concerns. Readiness is overrated. What matters is the quality of the work and the authenticity of the artistic vision. Both of those are clearly evident in what you've shown me today. She went on to explain the exhibition concept in more detail. The show would feature 6 contemporary sculptors who were working in traditional stone carving techniques, but bringing modern sensibilities to the medium. The goal was to demonstrate that figurative sculpture remained a vital and evolving art form, not just a historical curiosity. The exhibition will run for 3 months, from September through November, Margaret continued. We'll need 3 to 4 pieces from each artist, with at least one significant work that can serve as a centerpiece. Based on what I'm seeing here, I think you could easily meet those requirements. The timeline was aggressive, but achievable. William had been working at an increasingly rapid pace, and the community support had given him confidence to attempt more ambitious projects. The marble sculpture that Margaret admired so much would be an obvious choice for inclusion, and he had ideas for several other pieces that could complement it effectively. But Margaret's visit represented more than just an exhibition opportunity. Her presence in the workshop, her professional assessment of his work, and her willingness to include him alongside established artists validated everything that William had been working toward over the past months. It confirmed that the sounds echoing from his backyard studio really were creating something of value, something worthy of serious artistic attention. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused to examine the collection of Marcus Whitfield's original tools that Dr. Chen had loaned for the community event and that William had continued to use in his daily practice. Her expression grew thoughtful as she handled the worn implements. "You know, there's something poetic about these tools being used again," she said. Marcus always believed that artistic instruments had their own energy, their own accumulated wisdom. He would have loved knowing that his chisels were shaping new work, carrying forward the tradition he'd established in this space. She handed William her business card and arranged to return the following week with the exhibition contract and additional details about the show's requirements. As she walked toward the gate, she turned back with a final observation that would stay with William for weeks afterward. "The art world is full of people who talk about wanting to be artists," she said. "But very few have the discipline and dedication to actually do the work, day after day, without any guarantee of recognition or success. What you've accomplished here in 8 months is evidence of genuine artistic commitment. Don't underestimate the significance of that." After Margaret's departure, William stood alone in his workshop, surrounded by the familiar tools and materials that had become the center of his daily existence. But everything felt different now, charged with new possibilities and weighted with new responsibilities. The work that had begun as personal exploration, driven by unemployment and creative curiosity, had evolved into something that professional eyes judged worthy of public presentation. The marble sculpture seemed to glow in the afternoon light, no longer just a private achievement but a piece destined for public exhibition, for critical assessment, for the kind of cultural dialogue that separates art from craft. William realized that his relationship to the work would never be quite the same. It would always carry the memory of Margaret Thorne's professional validation, the knowledge that serious artistic institutions took his efforts seriously. But, perhaps more importantly, Margaret's visit had confirmed that the workshop's revival was about more than just individual artistic development. It was about reconnecting with cultural traditions that had deep roots in the community, about demonstrating that contemporary art could emerge from suburban neighborhoods as easily as from urban galleries, about proving that artistic excellence could flourish anywhere that genuine commitment and community support intersected. As William picked up his chisel and returned to work on the limestone piece, he felt the weight of Marcus Whitfield's legacy in a new way. He wasn't just using the older artist's tools and workspace, he was carrying forward a tradition of serious artistic practice that had been temporarily interrupted, but never truly abandoned. The sounds echoing from the workshop were the same sounds that had defined this space for decades, the rhythm of creation that connected past and future in an unbroken chain of artistic dedication. The exhibition would be William's first real test as a professional artist, his introduction to the broader art world that existed beyond his neighborhood's supportive embrace. But the foundation had been laid through months of disciplined work, community engagement, and the gradual recognition that true artistry required not just technical skill, but the courage to make one's creative vision visible to others. In the weeks that followed Margaret's visit, as William prepared for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, he would often remember her observation about the tools carrying forward Marcus Whitfield's accumulated wisdom. Each strike of chisel against stone seemed to echo not just his own intentions, but the intentions of everyone who had worked in this space before him, creating art that would outlast the individual artists who gave it form. The weeks following Margaret Thorne's visit unleashed a creative energy in William that surprised even him. With a firm exhibition deadline and the knowledge that his work would be displayed alongside established artists, every day in the studio carried new urgency and focus. But rather than feeling pressured, William found himself entering a state of flow that seemed to make time elastic, where hours passed like minutes, and each sculpture session built momentum toward the next. The first challenge was selecting which pieces would represent his work in the exhibition. Margaret had requested 3 to 4 sculptures, with at least one major piece serving as a centerpiece. The marble figure that had impressed both his neighbors and Margaret herself was an obvious choice, but William knew he needed to demonstrate range and artistic growth beyond that single achievement. This decision led him to embark on the most ambitious project of his artistic career, a series of 3 interconnected limestone sculptures that would explore the concept of artistic awakening. Each piece would represent a different stage of creative development: dormancy, emergence, and full expression. The technical challenges were formidable, but William felt drawn to work that would push his skills to their current limits and, perhaps, beyond. The first piece in the series, which he titled Potential, depicted a figure still largely trapped within raw stone, with only subtle hints of the human form beginning to emerge from the rough surface. The concept required William to maintain areas of natural stone texture while creating precise, smooth transitions where the figure began to take shape. It was meticulous work that demanded patience and restraint, qualities that his months of disciplined practice had developed. Working on Potential required William to develop new techniques for creating contrast between finished and unfinished surfaces. He experimented with different chisel angles and striking patterns, learning to read the stone's grain structure to predict how it would respond to various tools. The process was intensely meditative, requiring complete focus on the immediate interaction between tool and material. Charlotte Morrison had become a regular visitor during these intensive work sessions, often stopping by with coffee or lunch, when she noticed William had been working for hours without a break. Her initial concern about noise had transformed into fascination with the creative process, and she'd begun documenting William's progress with photography, creating a visual record of each sculpture's evolution from rough block to finished work. "You're different when you're working," she observed one afternoon, as William paused to assess his progress on Potential. "More centered, more sure of yourself. It's like watching someone speak their native language after hearing them struggle with translation." Her comment struck William as particularly insightful. The studio had indeed become a place where he felt most authentically himself, where the uncertainty and self-doubt that had plagued him during his unemployment seemed to dissolve in the face of clear creative purpose. The work provided not just artistic fulfillment, but psychological healing, a way of rebuilding confidence through tangible achievement. The second piece in the series, Emergence, presented even greater technical challenges. William envisioned a figure caught in the moment of breaking free from stone constraints, with dynamic tension between areas of smooth, finished surface and sections where the sculpture seemed to fracture and explode outward. Achieving this effect required precise control over tool pressure and angle, creating deliberate roughness that looked spontaneous while maintaining structural integrity. Henry Morrison, whose construction background had made him curious about the technical aspects of stone carving, volunteered to help William solve some of the engineering challenges involved in emergence. The sculpture's dynamic composition created potential stress points that needed to be reinforced without compromising the visual impact. Henry's expertise in structural design proved invaluable in planning the piece's internal architecture. "It's fascinating how similar this is to building construction," Henry observed as they discussed load distribution and stress management. "You're essentially engineering a structure that has to support its own weight while creating the illusion of defying gravity." Their collaboration represented another evolution in William's relationship with his neighbors. What had begun as conflict over noise had transformed into active partnership in creative problem-solving. Henry's contributions weren't just practical, they represented the kind of community support that made ambitious artistic projects possible. The third piece, Expression, was conceived as the series' culmination, a figure in full artistic flight, tools in hand, captured in the moment of creative inspiration. This sculpture would be the most technically demanding, requiring William to carve convincing representations of both human anatomy and the tools of artistic creation. Every detail would need to be precise, from the figure's focused expression to the realistic depiction of chisel and hammer. Working on Expression, pushed William to develop new levels of skill in figurative carving. He studied anatomy texts, practiced rendering fabric textures, and experimented with techniques for creating the illusion of movement in static stone. The learning curve was steep, but William found that each challenge overcome opened new possibilities for artistic expression. Mrs. Patterson became an unexpected source of encouragement during the most difficult phases of this work. Her memories of Marcus Whitfield's creative process provided context for the struggles William was experiencing, reassuring him that periods of frustration and apparent stagnation were normal parts of artistic development. Marcus used to get so frustrated. Sometimes, she recalled during one of her afternoon visits, I'd see him standing in front of a piece for hours, just staring at it, trying to figure out what it wanted to become. Then suddenly he'd start working again, and everything would fall into place. Her stories helped William understand that his own creative process was following patterns that had been established by generations of artists working in similar conditions. The workshop seemed to carry institutional memory, accumulated wisdom about how artistic creation actually worked, rather than how it was supposed to work in theory. As summer progressed, William's daily routine became increasingly intense. He was working longer hours, driven by both exhibition deadlines and the momentum of creative breakthrough. The three-piece series was consuming most of his attention, but he was also developing ideas for additional sculptures that might be included in the show. One of these additional pieces emerged from his growing understanding of the workshop's historical significance. Inspired by his research into Marcus Whitfield's career, William began carving a portrait bust that would honor the older artist's contribution to the space and to the community's cultural heritage. The piece would serve as a bridge between past and present, acknowledging the artistic lineage that William was continuing. Creating a portrait from historical photographs presented unique challenges that forced William to develop new observational skills. He studied images of Whitfield from different periods, analyzing facial structure and character lines, learning to translate two-dimensional information into three-dimensional form. The work required not just technical skill, but interpretive sensitivity, capturing not just physical likeness, but something of the subject's artistic spirit. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Historical Society became a valuable collaborator on this project, providing additional photographic references and sharing insights about Whitfield's personality and artistic philosophy. Her involvement helped ensure that the portrait would be historically accurate while serving William's artistic vision. "What strikes me about your approach," Dr. Chen observed as she watched William work on the portrait, "is how you're not trying to imitate Marcus's style, but you're clearly inspired by his example. That's the difference between copying and continuing a tradition." The distinction was important to William. He wanted to honor Whitfield's legacy without being constrained by it, to demonstrate that artistic traditions could evolve while maintaining their essential character. The portrait became a meditation on artistic influence and independence, on how contemporary artists could draw strength from their predecessors while finding their own authentic voices. As August arrived and the exhibition opening approached, William's studio was filled with more completed work than he'd ever imagined possible. The three-piece series was nearing completion. The Marcus Whitfield portrait was taking recognizable shape, and several smaller experimental pieces had emerged from moments of creative exploration between major projects. The transformation was visible not just in the quantity of work, but in its sophistication. Each piece demonstrated greater technical mastery and conceptual clarity than its predecessors, evidence of rapid artistic development that even William found surprising. The intensive focus had accelerated his learning curve in ways that part-time dabbling never could have achieved. Margaret Thorne returned for a progress review in late August, and her reaction exceeded William's expectations. She moved through the studio with obvious excitement, examining each piece carefully and asking detailed questions about technique and concept. Her professional assessment was unequivocally positive. "This is remarkable progress," she said, as she studied the nearly complete expression sculpture, not just in technical terms, but in artistic maturity. These pieces show an artist who's found his voice, who has something distinctive to contribute to contemporary sculpture. Margaret's enthusiasm extended beyond individual pieces to the body of work as a whole. She could see connections between sculptures that created dialogue and development, evidence of an artistic vision that was both coherent and evolving. The workshop had produced not just isolated artworks, but a genuine artistic statement. "I'm going to feature your 3-piece series as one of the exhibition's centerpieces," Margaret announced. "It's exactly the kind of work that demonstrates why stone carving remains relevant to contemporary art. You're using traditional techniques to thoroughly explore modern themes, artistic identity, creative development, the relationship between individual expression and cultural continuity." The decision to feature William's work prominently in the exhibition represented validation beyond his wildest expectations when he'd first started working in the converted shed. But Margaret's praise came with increased responsibility and pressure. His sculptures would be among the first things visitors saw when they entered the gallery, setting the tone for the entire exhibition. As William prepared for the final push, toward exhibition completion, he reflected on how completely his life had changed over the past year. The unemployment that had initially seemed like a professional disaster had become the catalyst for discovering his true calling. The neighbor complaints that had threatened to shut down his artistic practice had evolved into community support that made ambitious work possible. The workshop itself had been transformed from a source of conflict into a symbol of cultural continuity, a space where contemporary creativity connected with historical tradition. The sounds that had once prompted noise complaints were now recognized as evidence of serious artistic production, worthy of respect and protection. But perhaps most importantly, William had discovered that artistic excellence wasn't something that happened in isolation. It required community engagement, historical awareness, and the courage to make one's creative vision visible to others. The exhibition would be his first major test of whether the work he'd been creating in his backyard studio could speak to audiences beyond his supportive neighbors. As September approached and the final preparations for the exhibition intensified, William knew that he was approaching a threshold in his artistic career. The show would determine whether his transformation from unemployed marketing professional to serious sculptor represented genuine artistic achievement or merely an extended period of creative self-indulgence. The answer would come soon enough. But for now, there was still work to be done, still stone to be carved, still details to be refined. The exhibition deadline was approaching, and William was determined that every piece would represent his absolute best effort, worthy of the space that had nurtured their creation and the community that had supported their development. The morning of the exhibition opening dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of September light that made everything appear sharply defined and full of possibility. William had barely slept, his mind cycling through final details and potential problems, but as he stood in his backyard studio surrounded by the empty spaces where his sculptures had been just days before, he felt a strange calm settling over him. The installation process at the Millbrook Contemporary Arts Center had taken 3 days, with professional art handlers carefully transporting and positioning each piece according to Margaret Thorne's precise specifications. William had watched his sculptures leave the familiar confines of his workshop with mixed emotions: pride at seeing them treated with museum-quality care, but also a kind of separation anxiety as the works that had defined his daily existence for months disappeared into the formal gallery environment. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Sculptures that had seemed large and imposing in his backyard workshop appeared elegant and properly scaled within the gallery's soaring spaces. The 3-piece series had been positioned to create a natural flow of movement, guiding visitors through the narrative of artistic awakening that William had envisioned. Professional lighting brought out details and textures that had been less visible under the workshop's fluorescent fixtures. Margaret had insisted that William attend the installation process, partly to answer technical questions about the work, but also to experience how his art functioned in a professional context. The gallery staff treated his sculptures with the same reverence accorded to works by established masters, using specialized equipment and handling procedures that emphasized the piece's value and fragility. "This is where your work truly comes alive," Margaret had explained as they watched the final positioning of Expression, the series' culminating piece. These sculptures were always meant for public viewing, for the kind of contemplation and dialogue that only happens when art meets its intended audience. Now, hours before the opening reception, William found himself in the unusual position of having nothing immediate to do. His neighbors had organized a pre-reception gathering at his house, partly to celebrate his achievement, but also to provide moral support before what would undoubtedly be a nerve-wracking evening of public scrutiny and professional assessment. Charlotte. Morrison arrived first, carrying a garment bag containing what she announced was appropriate gallery attire that she'd selected for the occasion. Her transformation from noise complainer to artistic advocate had been one of the most surprising developments of the entire experience, and her attention to details like William's appearance at the opening demonstrated how invested she'd become in his success. "You need to look like you belong in that gallery," she said firmly, hanging the carefully chosen outfit in his bedroom. "This isn't just about the art anymore. It's about establishing yourself as a professional artist who deserves to be taken seriously." Henry Morrison followed with a professional quality portfolio containing high-resolution photographs of William's sculptures, business cards that he'd designed and printed, and a collection of positive reviews and articles that had appeared in local media as word of the exhibition had spread. His documentation efforts had created a comprehensive record of William's artistic development that would be invaluable for future opportunities. "Documentation is crucial in the art world," Henry explained as he arranged the materials. "People need to see that you're organized, professional, and serious about your career. Tonight isn't just an exhibition opening, it's your professional debut." Mrs. Patterson appeared with a covered dish and stories about Marcus Whitfield's first major exhibition, which had taken place at the same gallery nearly 40 years earlier. Her historical perspective provided context that helped calm William's nerves, reminding him that every successful artist had experienced similar moments of public vulnerability and professional uncertainty. "Marcus was terrified at his opening," she recalled with obvious affection. "He spent the whole evening convinced that people were just being polite, that his work wasn't really good enough for serious attention. But by the end of the night, he had 3 sales and 2 commission offers. Sometimes artists are the last ones to recognize their own success." Amelia Rodriguez arrived with legal documents, a formal business license for William's artistic practice, incorporation papers for what she'd titled Chen Studio Arts, and contracts that would protect his interests in any sales or future commissions that might result from the exhibition. Her transformation from legal antagonist to business advisor represented another remarkable reversal in neighborhood relationships. "You're about to become a professional artist," Amelia explained, as she walked William through the paperwork. "That means treating your practice like the business it now is. These documents will ensure that you're properly protected and positioned to take advantage of whatever opportunities arise tonight." Dr. Sarah Chen from the Historical Society brought a special gift, Marcus Whitfield's original artist statement, from his 1978 exhibition, which she'd discovered in the archives. The document provided insight into how the older artist had thought about his work and its relationship to community, themes that resonate strongly with William's own artistic philosophy. Reading this, you can see how much your approach mirrors Marcus's values, Dr. Chen observed. He believed that art should serve the community that supports it, that individual creativity flourishes when it's connected to larger social purposes. Your work carries forward that same commitment. As afternoon turned to evening, the informal gathering took on increasingly ceremonial qualities. Tom Bradley, who lived several streets away but had become genuinely invested in William's success, proposed a toast to commemorate the occasion. The neighbors raised their glasses with obvious pride, recognizing that William's achievement reflected positively on their entire community. "A year ago, none of us knew we had an artist living among us," Tom said. "Tonight, the whole city will know. That's something we can all take pride in." The drive to the Millbrook Contemporary Arts Center felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. William found himself hypersensitive to every detail: the way evening light fell across the gallery's distinctive architecture, the growing number of cars in the parking area, the professionally printed banners announcing the exhibition that featured his name alongside 5 other contemporary sculptors. Margaret Thorne met William at the gallery entrance, her obvious excitement helping to counteract his mounting nervousness. She'd changed from her usual austere professional attire into something more festive, acknowledging the celebratory nature of the evening while maintaining her authoritative presence. "The early reviews have been exceptional," she reported as they walked toward the gallery. "The art critic from the Regional Tribune specifically mentioned your 3-piece series as evidence that contemporary stone carving has genuine vitality. That's exactly the kind of recognition we were hoping to achieve." The gallery was already filling with visitors when they entered, a mix of established collectors, other artists, museum patrons, and curious community members who had heard about the exhibition through word-of-mouth publicity. William was struck by the diversity of the crowd. People who clearly moved comfortably in gallery environments alongside others who seemed as uncertain about exhibition etiquette as he felt. His sculptures commanded immediate attention. The 3-piece series had been positioned in the gallery's central space, where visitors encountered them upon entering. Professional lighting had transformed the works, bringing out subtleties of texture and form that even William hadn't fully appreciated in his workshop setting. The pieces seemed to glow with internal energy, drawing viewers into close examination of details and techniques. William watched from a distance as strangers engaged with his work, studying their expressions and body language for clues about their responses. Some visitors moved quickly past, but others lingered, walking around individual pieces multiple times and engaging in animated discussions about technique and meaning. The level of serious attention was both gratifying and intimidating. The first person to approach William directly was Dr. James Harrison, the art history professor from the regional university, whose students regularly visited the gallery for educational purposes. His assessment carried particular weight because of his academic credentials and his reputation for honest, informed criticism. "These are remarkable pieces," Dr. Harrison said after introducing himself. "What strikes me most is the confidence of the execution. These don't look like the work of someone who's been carving for less than a year. The technical mastery suggests much more extensive experience." William found himself explaining his intensive practice schedule, the influence of working in Marcus Whitfield's original workshop, and the community support that had made such focused, artistic development possible. Dr. Harrison listened with obvious interest, asking detailed questions about technique and artistic philosophy. "What you've accomplished is quite unusual," Dr. Harrison observed. "Most contemporary sculptors working in traditional media have formal training that takes years to complete. Your approach, intensive self-directed study combined with historical research and community engagement, represents an alternative model that deserves serious academic attention." The conversation attracted other listeners, including several artists whose work was featured in the exhibition. William found himself at the center of discussions about artistic education, the role of community in creative development, and the ways that historical spaces could influence contemporary practice. The level of intellectual engagement was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Sarah Martinez, whose bronze sculptures occupied another section of the gallery, was particularly interested in William's relationship to Marcus Whitfield's legacy. As an artist who had also developed her practice through unconventional means, she understood the challenges and advantages of working outside traditional institutional frameworks. "The art world needs more stories like yours," she said during a quiet moment in their conversation. Too many people think that artistic success requires following predetermined paths through schools and galleries. Your example proves that genuine talent can emerge anywhere, given the right combination of dedication and support. The evening's emotional peak came when William's neighbors arrived as a group, clearly proud of their association with his success. Charlotte and Henry Morrison had brought professional quality photographs of the community gathering where William had first displayed his work publicly, creating a visual record of the grassroots support that had made his artistic development possible. Mrs. Patterson, despite her age, had insisted on attending to represent the neighborhood's historical memory and to honor Marcus Whitfield's connection to the current exhibition. Her presence attracted attention from other visitors who remembered the original artist, creating impromptu discussions about artistic continuity and the role of place in creative development. "This is what Marcus would have wanted," Mrs. Patterson declared as she stood before the three-piece series. "He always believed that this workshop should continue producing art, that the space itself had accumulated creative energy that shouldn't be wasted. Seeing these sculptures here, knowing they were created in the same place where Marcus worked, it feels like completing a circle." The financial aspect of the evening proved as surprising as the critical reception. By the time the formal reception concluded, William had received serious inquiries about purchasing 2 of his smaller pieces, as well as preliminary discussions about commissioned work that could provide sustainable income for continued artistic practice. Margaret Thorne approached William as the evening wound down, her expression reflecting satisfaction with the exhibition's reception and excitement about William's future prospects. The opening had exceeded her expectations in terms of both attendance and critical response, positioning the entire show as a significant success for the gallery. "This is just the beginning," she said as they watched the last visitors departing. "The kind of attention your work has received tonight creates momentum that can carry an artistic career forward for years. You've established yourself as a serious sculptor whose work deserves ongoing attention." As William finally returned home in the late evening, his backyard studio felt different, emptier without the sculptures that had defined its purpose for months, but also somehow larger, as if success had expanded its possibilities. The workshop was no longer just a place where he made art for personal satisfaction. It had become the foundation of a professional practice that connected him to broader cultural conversations. The reviews that appeared in the following days confirmed what the opening night reception had suggested. William's work was being taken seriously by critics and collectors, positioned not as amateur curiosity but as genuine contribution to contemporary sculpture. The three-piece series was particularly praised for its conceptual sophistication and technical accomplishment. But perhaps more importantly, the exhibition had validated the community support that had made William's artistic development possible. His neighbors' investment in his success had been rewarded with recognition that reflected positively on their entire neighborhood, proving that grassroots cultural advocacy could produce results that benefited everyone involved. The backyard, studio that had once been a source of complaint and conflict, had become a symbol of what was possible when individual creativity and community support aligned around shared values. The sounds that echoed from the converted shed were no longer sources of irritation, but evidence of ongoing cultural vitality, the rhythm of tradition being renewed through contemporary practice. 6 months after the exhibition opening, William stood in his transformed workshop on a bright March morning, surrounded by evidence of how completely his life had changed. The space that had once been a source of neighborhood conflict had evolved into something unprecedented in Millbrook Heights, a fully operational artist's studio that served simultaneously as private workspace, community cultural center, and pilgrimage destination for aspiring sculptors from across the region. The success of his exhibition debut had generated opportunities that William could never have imagined during those early months of neighborhood complaints and zoning disputes. 3 of his sculptures had been sold to private collectors, providing financial stability that allowed him to dedicate himself full-time to artistic practice. More significantly, The Millbrook Contemporary Arts Center had commissioned him to create a permanent public sculpture for the city's new cultural district, a project that would establish his work as part of the community's permanent artistic landscape. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been the formal establishment of the Marcus Whitfield Memorial Workshop, a collaborative initiative between William, the Millbrook Historical Society, and the Neighborhood Association. The program offered monthly workshops where community members could learn basic stone carving techniques, quarterly lectures on local artistic history, and an annual scholarship for promising young sculptors to study in the space where 2 generations of artists had developed their craft. Dr. Sarah Chen had been instrumental in securing grant funding for the memorial workshop, successfully arguing that the program represented exactly the kind of community-based cultural preservation that foundations were eager to support. The grants covered equipment, materials, and a modest stipend for William's teaching responsibilities, creating a sustainable model that honored the past while nurturing future artistic development. What you've created here goes far beyond individual artistic success, Dr. Chen observed as she reviewed the workshop's first year of programming. You've demonstrated how contemporary artists can serve as cultural stewards, connecting historical traditions to present communities in ways that benefit everyone involved. The teaching component had proven unexpectedly rewarding for William. Working with students of varying ages and skill levels had deepened his own understanding of sculptural techniques, forcing him to articulate processes that he'd learned intuitively through months of intensive practice. Each class brought new challenges and insights, preventing the isolation that often plagued professional artists working in solitude. Among his most dedicated students was Elena Vasquez, a recently retired engineer whose precision and patience made her a natural stone carver. Her technical background brought new perspectives to traditional techniques, leading to innovations in tool design and stone preparation that William incorporated into his own practice. Their collaboration exemplified the kind of cross-generational knowledge sharing that the memorial workshop was designed to facilitate. Engineering and sculpture aren't as different as people think, Elena explained during one of their collaborative sessions. Both require understanding material properties, visualizing 3-dimensional relationships, and solving complex structural problems. The artistic vision is what makes sculpture special, but the technical foundation is crucial for realizing that vision effectively. Another regular participant was Marcus Thompson, a high school student whose natural artistic talent had been recognized by his art teacher. The teenager's enthusiasm and fearless experimentation reminded William of his own early discoveries in the medium, while his contemporary perspective challenged traditional approaches to figurative representation. Working with stone feels like archaeology in reverse, Marcus observed while developing his first serious sculpture. Instead of uncovering what's already there, you're hiding what you want to reveal, creating mysteries that viewers have to solve by looking carefully. The young sculptor's insight captured something essential about the medium that William had sensed but never articulated so clearly. Stone carving wasn't just about removing unwanted material. It was about creating dialogue between revelation and concealment, between what was obvious and what required patient observation to understand. The workshop's success had attracted attention from art educators and cultural institutions throughout the region. William found himself invited to speak at conferences about community-based artistic education, alternative models for artist development, and the role of historical spaces in contemporary cultural programming. His story had become a case study in how individual passion and community support could create cultural resources that served broader social purposes. One particularly significant invitation had come from the State Arts Council, which was developing a statewide initiative to support artist-led community programs. William's presentation at their annual conference had led to additional funding opportunities and invitations to consult on similar projects in other communities. His accidental discovery of effective cultural programming models was being replicated and adapted across the region. Your approach represents a paradigm shift in how we think about artist residencies and community engagement. explained Janet Morrison, the Arts Council's Director of Community Programs. Instead of bringing outside artists into communities, for short-term projects, you've demonstrated how local artists can develop deep, sustained relationships with their neighbors that create lasting cultural institutions. The recognition had brought William to the attention of gallery curators and collectors beyond his immediate region. His work was now represented in collections from Chicago to Atlanta, with exhibitions planned in cities he'd never visited. The international stone carving community had embraced him as an important new voice, inviting him to participate in symposiums and collaborative projects that connected traditional techniques to contemporary artistic discourse. But despite these expanding opportunities, William remained committed to maintaining his primary studio in the converted shed behind his house on Elm Street. The space had shaped not just his artistic technique, but his understanding of how art could function in community contexts. Moving to a more conventional studio setting would have meant abandoning the relationships and responsibilities that had made his success meaningful. The neighbors who had initially complained about his noise had become his most ardent supporters and advocates. Charlotte Morrison had documented the workshop's evolution through hundreds of photographs, creating a visual archive of community transformation that attracted interest from sociologists studying grassroots cultural development. Her images showed not just William's artistic progress, but the way shared creative projects could strengthen neighborhood bonds and create new forms of social capital. Henry Morrison had channeled his construction expertise into helping William design and build a proper gallery space adjacent to the workshop, where finished sculptures could be displayed for visitors without disrupting ongoing work. The addition had been funded through a combination of private donations from neighbors, grants from local businesses, and proceeds from sculpture sales, creating a model of community-supported cultural infrastructure. This whole experience has changed how I think about what makes a neighborhood valuable, Henry reflected, as they installed climate control systems in the new gallery space. We moved here for quiet and privacy, but what we've gained through William's work is so much richer. A sense of shared purpose and cultural identity that you can't buy with higher property values. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s, had become the workshop's unofficial historian and storyteller, sharing memories of Marcus Whitfield's era with visitors and students. Her presence provided living continuity between past and present, helping newcomers understand that they were participating in traditions with deep roots in the community's cultural development. Watching William's success has been like seeing Marcus's dreams fulfilled, she said during the workshop's first anniversary celebration. Marcus always believed that this space could inspire multiple generations of artists, that the work he started here could continue long after he was gone. William has proven that vision was exactly right. The anniversary event itself had drawn over 200 visitors, including the mayor, representatives from cultural institutions throughout the state, and artists who had traveled significant distances to see the workshop that had generated so much attention in sculpture circles. The gathering felt like a natural evolution of the small community meeting where William had first displayed his work publicly, but scaled up to reflect the broader recognition his efforts had achieved. Margaret Thorne delivered the keynote address, placing William's achievement in the context of broader trends in contemporary art and cultural programming. Her remarks emphasized how his success represented possibilities that existed in communities everywhere, waiting for the right combination of individual initiative and collective support to bring them to fruition. What William has accomplished demonstrates that artistic excellence doesn't require urban sophistication or institutional validation, Margaret observed. It requires dedication, community engagement, and the courage to pursue creative vision despite initial obstacles. Those qualities can emerge anywhere, given the right encouragement and support. The event also marked the announcement of William's most ambitious project to date, a collaborative public sculpture that would involve community members in its creation. The piece, commissioned for the town square's renovation, would incorporate stone carved by workshop participants under William's direction, creating a permanent symbol of collective creative achievement. "This sculpture will belong to everyone who contributes to it," William explained to the gathered crowd. "It will represent not just artistic accomplishment, but community collaboration, showing that meaningful art emerges from shared effort and mutual support." The collaborative sculpture project represented William's vision for the workshop's future role in community cultural development. Rather than simply serving as a space where he pursued individual artistic goals, the workshop would become a catalyst for collective creative projects that engaged neighbors as active participants rather than passive observers. Planning for the community sculpture had already begun generating excitement throughout Millbrook Heights and beyond. Families were discussing how they might contribute to the project, schools were developing curricula that would connect to the sculpture's themes, and local businesses were exploring sponsorship opportunities that would demonstrate their support for community-based cultural initiatives. The design process itself was being conducted through public meetings where community members could propose ideas, discuss artistic concepts, and participate in decision-making about the sculpture's final form. William facilitated these discussions while ensuring that the artistic vision remained coherent and achievable, demonstrating leadership skills that he'd never known he possessed. Leading collaborative projects requires different abilities than individual artistic creation, William reflected as he prepared for another community design meeting. "You have to listen carefully to multiple perspectives, find common ground between conflicting visions, and maintain artistic integrity while incorporating diverse contributions. It's challenging, but incredibly rewarding work." The collaborative approach had attracted attention from public art administrators in other cities, who saw Williams' model as a potential solution to common problems with community-commissioned artwork. Too often, public art projects generated controversy because communities felt excluded from creative decisions, resulting in sculptures that satisfied neither artistic standards nor local preferences. Williams' inclusive process promised to create public art that would be embraced by its community, because residents had participated directly in its conception and creation. The approach required more time and coordination than traditional commissioning processes, but the results seemed likely to be more durable and meaningful for everyone involved. As spring arrived and the workshop entered its second year of formal programming, William found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought him from unemployed marketing professional to established artist and community cultural leader. The transformation had required not just developing sculptural skills, but learning to navigate complex relationships between individual creativity and collective responsibility. The sounds that echoed from the workshop now represented something far more complex than the simple noise complaints that had originally brought him into conflict with his neighbors. Each strike of chisel against stone carried forward traditions that connected past, present, and future, individual expression and community identity, local heritage, and universal artistic values. Students working in the space were developing their own relationships to the medium, finding personal meaning in techniques that William had first discovered through solitary experimentation. Their diverse backgrounds and perspectives enriched the workshop's cultural environment, creating the kind of creative community that Marcus Whitfield had envisioned decades earlier. The workshop's success had also generated unexpected economic benefits for the broader neighborhood. Property values had increased as the area gained recognition as a cultural destination. Local businesses reported increased foot traffic from workshop visitors, and several neighbors had launched complementary enterprises, bed and breakfast accommodations, specialized art supply retail, and catering services for workshop events. What started as a noise complaint has turned into the best thing that's happened to this neighborhood in decades, observed Tom Bradley, whose property backed up to Williams' workshop. "We've got cultural programming that people travel hundreds of miles to experience, right here in our backyard. That's not something you can plan. It has to emerge from genuine community engagement and mutual respect." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Managing increased visitor traffic, balancing private studio needs with public programming responsibilities, and maintaining artistic focus while fulfilling community obligations required constant attention and adjustment. William had learned to set boundaries that protected his creative time while honoring commitments to neighbors and students. Professional success had also brought pressures that he'd never anticipated: gallery expectations, collector demands, and media attention created external validation that was gratifying but potentially distracting from the internal motivations that had driven his initial artistic development. Maintaining authenticity while navigating commercial art markets required conscious effort and regular reassessment of priorities. Success changes the context for everything you do, William observed during a quiet morning in the workshop. The same techniques and materials that once provided escape from external pressures now carry expectations and responsibilities that didn't exist before. Learning to work effectively within those new constraints is as challenging as mastering stone carving techniques, but the rewards continued to outweigh the challenges. Each completed sculpture represented not just individual achievement, but contribution to ongoing cultural conversations that connected his neighborhood to broader, artistic communities. Students developing their own sculptural voices demonstrated that the workshop was fulfilling its educational mission, creating multiplier effects that would extend its influence far beyond William's own career. The collaborative public sculpture was nearing completion, with over 40 community members having contributed directly to its creation. The piece had evolved into something more complex and meaningful than anything William could have created alone, demonstrating how individual artistic vision could be enhanced rather than compromised by collaborative processes. As William prepared for the sculpture's public dedication ceremony, he felt profound gratitude for the unlikely series of events that had transformed a neighborhood conflict into a cultural celebration. The unemployed man who had started making noise in his backyard had become a catalyst for community development that served as a model for other neighborhoods facing similar opportunities and challenges. The dedication ceremony itself would mark not an ending, but a new beginning, the completion of one chapter in an ongoing story of how art could transform communities when individual passion aligned with collective support. The workshop would continue its programming. New students would discover their own relationships to stone and chisel, and the sounds of creation would echo across Millbrook Heights for generations to come. Standing in the space where Marcus Whitfield had first established an artist's workshop nearly 60 years earlier, William felt the weight and privilege of cultural stewardship. The tools, techniques, and traditions that had shaped his own development were now being passed to others who would carry them forward in directions he couldn't predict or control. The story that had begun with neighborhood complaints about noise had evolved into something far richer and more complex, a demonstration of how individual creativity and community engagement could create cultural resources that served broader social purposes while honoring historical traditions and nurturing future possibilities. The sounds echoing from the workshop were no longer sources of irritation, but symbols of hope, evidence that meaningful transformation remained possible in communities willing to support the creative vision of their neighbors. The ripple effects of William's success continued expanding in unexpected directions. Universities began incorporating the Millbrook Heights model into their community engagement curricula, sending graduate students to document the workshop's methods and outcomes. The case study had become required reading in arts administration programs, urban planning courses, and sociology departments studying grassroots cultural development. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the university's Public Policy Institute had spent an entire semester researching the workshop's economic and social impacts. Her findings revealed measurable improvements in neighborhood cohesion, property maintenance standards, and civic participation rates that extended far beyond the immediate area around William's studio. The workshop has created what we call cultural magnetism, Dr. Martinez explained in her published report. Communities with active artistic programming tend to attract other cultural initiatives, creating cumulative effects that transform entire districts. William's workshop has been the catalyst for at least 6 other creative enterprises that have established themselves in Millbrook Heights over the past year. These new enterprises included a pottery cooperative that had rented space in a renovated warehouse 3 blocks from the workshop, a fiber arts guild that met monthly in the community center, and a photography club that organized regular exhibitions in local businesses. Each initiative cited the workshop's example as inspiration for their own community-based programming, creating a network of creative activities that reinforced each other's success. The photography club had been particularly active in documenting the neighborhood's ongoing transformation. Their annual exhibition, titled Millbrook Heights, A Community in Creative Evolution, had drawn visitors from across the metropolitan area and had been featured in regional tourism publications. The images showed not just physical improvements, but captured the energy and pride that characterized the area's new cultural identity. Local government officials had taken notice of these developments, with the mayor announcing plans to designate Millbrook Heights as the city's first official cultural heritage district. The designation would provide tax incentives for cultural programming, streamlined permitting for artistic activities, and marketing support to attract additional visitors and participants. What's happening in Millbrook Heights represents exactly the kind of organic cultural development that cities spend millions trying to create artificially, the mayor observed during a press conference announcing the district designation. William, Chen and his neighbors have demonstrated that authentic cultural vitality emerges from community engagement and mutual support, not from top-down planning initiatives. The Cultural Heritage District designation had attracted attention from developers interested in creating similar environments in other neighborhoods, but William and his neighbors had been careful to ensure that commercial exploitation didn't undermine the authentic community relationships that had made their success possible. They'd worked with city planners to establish guidelines that would protect residential character while encouraging appropriate cultural development. These protective measures had become another model that other communities were studying and adapting. The balance between cultural tourism and neighborhood livability was a challenge facing creative districts nationwide, and the Millbrook Heights approach offered practical solutions that preserved community control over development decisions. International recognition had arrived when the workshop was selected for inclusion in a traveling exhibition about contemporary stone carving that would visit galleries in London, Berlin, and Tokyo. William's sculptures would represent American approaches to traditional techniques, placing his work in dialogue with artists from around the world who were similarly engaged in revitalizing ancient crafts. Being included in this exhibition feels surreal, William reflected as he prepared sculptures for international shipping. 3 years ago, I was unemployed and making noise complaints from neighbors. Now my work will be seen by audiences I never imagined reaching. The international exhibition had generated inquiries from collectors and institutions that previously would have been completely outside William's sphere of influence. A private foundation in Switzerland had commissioned a major work for their sculpture garden, while a museum in Japan had acquired one of his pieces for their permanent collection of contemporary American art. But perhaps the most meaningful international connection had come through an exchange program that brought visiting artists to work temporarily in the Marcus Whitfield Memorial Workshop. The first participant was Giovanni Rossini, a master stone carver from Italy whose family had been working in marble for 6 generations. "What you have created here is very special," Giovanni had observed during his month-long residency. "In Europe, we have many ancient workshops, but they often become museums, frozen in the past. Your workshop lives and breathes, honoring tradition while embracing innovation. This is the future of craftwork education." Giovanni's residency had enriched the workshop's programming in ways that continued long after his departure. He'd introduced techniques that had been refined over centuries in Italian workshops, while learning from William's community engagement approaches that were virtually unknown in traditional European ateliers. The cultural exchange had created lasting connections that would facilitate future collaborations and learning opportunities. The success of the international residency program had attracted additional visiting artists from countries including Mexico, South Korea, and Egypt. Each brought distinctive approaches to stone carving that reflected their cultural backgrounds, creating an increasingly diverse learning environment that benefited both visitors and local participants. Maria Santos, a sculptor from Mexico City who specialized in combining pre-Columbian techniques with contemporary themes, had left a particularly lasting impact on the workshop's programming. Her approach to surface texturing had influenced several local students, while her emphasis on sculpture's spiritual dimensions had deepened discussions about art's role in community healing and connection. "Stone remembers everything," Maria had explained during one of her public demonstrations. "Every strike of the chisel, every hour of patient work, every intention of the artist. It all becomes part of the finished piece. When you work with respect for the material and the tradition, you're creating objects that carry forward not just artistic vision, but cultural memory." The workshop's influence on local schools had created another avenue for expanding impact. Art teachers throughout the district had incorporated basic stone carving into their curricula, using techniques and approaches they'd learned through workshop programming. Students were creating small sculptures that reflected their own cultural backgrounds and personal interests, demonstrating how traditional crafts could serve contemporary educational goals. Lincoln Elementary School had gone furthest in integrating sculptural education, creating a permanent installation where student work was displayed alongside historical information about Marcus Whitfield and the workshop's development. The installation served both educational and inspirational purposes, showing young people that artistic achievement was possible, regardless of their current circumstances or backgrounds. Seeing professional quality art being created in their own neighborhood has changed how our students think about their own potential, explained Sarah Kim, the elementary school's principal. They understand that artists aren't mysterious figures from distant places. They're people who live among us, who've developed their abilities through practice and dedication. The educational impact had been measured through improved performance in multiple subjects, not just art classes. Students participating in sculpture programs showed enhanced spatial reasoning abilities, improved problem-solving skills, and increased confidence in tackling complex projects. The correlation between artistic engagement and academic achievement had attracted interest from educational researchers studying creative approaches to learning. High schools in the district had begun offering advanced sculpture courses that culminated in student exhibitions at the workshop's community gallery. These shows had become annual highlights that drew audiences including parents, local officials, and professional artists who served as mentors and judges. Several graduating students had received scholarships to art schools based on work they'd developed through these programs. The workshop's influence on local healthcare had emerged as an unexpected but significant development. Physical therapists had begun referring patients recovering from hand and arm injuries to participate in adapted stone carving exercises that rebuilt strength and coordination while providing psychological benefits associated with creative accomplishment. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who directed the Regional Rehabilitation Center, had collaborated with William to develop therapeutic protocols that used sculptural activities to address both physical and emotional aspects of recovery. The program had shown remarkable success rates, with participants reporting higher motivation and better overall outcomes compared to traditional therapy approaches. Working with stone provides resistance training that's perfect for rebuilding fine motor control, Dr. Walsh explained. But the creative satisfaction and sense of accomplishment provide psychological benefits that purely clinical exercises can't match. Patients leave sessions feeling they've created something beautiful, not just completed medical requirements. The therapeutic sculpture program had attracted attention from medical institutions throughout the region, with several hospitals implementing similar initiatives based on the Millbrook Heights model. William found himself consulting on program design and training healthcare professionals in basic sculptural techniques adapted for therapeutic use. Local businesses had organized themselves into the Millbrook Heights Cultural Commerce Association, a group dedicated to supporting and benefiting from the area's artistic reputation. Members included restaurants that featured sculpture-themed menus, shops selling locally made crafts, and service providers who had developed specializations serving the creative community. The Stone's Throw Cafe had become an unofficial gathering place for workshop participants and visitors. Its walls lined with photographs documenting the neighborhood's artistic evolution. Owner Patricia Chen, another unrelated Chen, had created a menu featuring dishes named after various sculptural techniques, while hosting monthly poetry readings and acoustic music performances that complemented the visual arts programming. The workshop has transformed our entire business model, Patricia explained. We went from being a neighborhood breakfast spot to being a cultural destination that attracts visitors from hours away. That's brought opportunities we never could have imagined when we first opened. The economic impact extended beyond hospitality. Businesses to include specialized suppliers who had established relationships with the workshop and its network of associated artists. Tool manufacturers, stone suppliers, and equipment vendors had developed Millbrook Heights as a significant market for their products, creating jobs and business opportunities that supported the broader regional economy. Transportation patterns had shifted as well, with the local bus system adding weekend routes to accommodate workshop visitors who didn't drive. The changes had improved public transit access for all neighborhood residents, demonstrating how cultural programming could generate infrastructure improvements that benefited entire communities. Real estate professionals reported that properties throughout Millbrook Heights were selling faster and at higher prices than comparable homes in other neighborhoods, with buyers specifically citing the area's cultural programming as a deciding factor. The phenomenon had attracted attention from urban planners studying relationships between arts programming and property values, but residents remained vigilant about preventing gentrification that might displace long-term neighbors or fundamentally alter the community character that had made the workshop's success possible. They'd worked with housing advocates to establish programs that helped existing residents benefit from increased property values without being forced to relocate due to rising costs. The workshop's environmental impact had been another area of unexpected innovation. William had partnered with local quarries to establish sustainable sourcing practices that minimize transportation costs and environmental impacts while supporting regional businesses. Waste stone from sculptural projects was being recycled into landscaping materials and construction aggregate, creating closed-loop systems that eliminated disposal problems. Solar panels installed on the workshop's roof provided clean energy for tools and lighting, while rainwater collection systems supplied water for cleaning and cooling processes. These environmental initiatives had attracted recognition from sustainability organizations and had been replicated at cultural institutions throughout the region. As William prepared for the upcoming 5th anniversary celebration of his first community presentation, he reflected on the exponential growth of impact that had emerged from what began as a simple conflict over noise. The workshop had become far more than an artist's studio or even a community cultural center. It had evolved into a catalyst for comprehensive neighborhood transformation that demonstrated possibilities for creative community development. The anniversary event would feature not just celebration, but forward-looking discussions about the workshop's next phase of development. Plans were underway for a sister workshop in the city's underserved Eastern District, satellite programming in rural communities throughout the region, and expanded international exchange opportunities that would further strengthen connections between local and global artistic communities. The sounds that had once prompted complaints now served as a beacon drawing creative individuals from around the world to a small neighborhood in Millbrook Heights, where they discovered that artistic tradition and community support could combine to create opportunities that transformed both individual lives and collective possibilities. The workshop had proven that cultural resources could emerge anywhere that dedication, vision, and mutual support aligned around shared values of creativity, education, and community service. The technological integration that had emerged around the workshop represented another frontier of innovation that William had never anticipated. A local software developer named Alex Rivera had approached him about documenting sculptural techniques through virtual reality, creating immersive educational experiences that could transmit traditional knowledge to students worldwide. The project had evolved into a comprehensive digital archive of stone carving methods, complete with 360-degree documentation of master craftspeople demonstrating techniques that had been passed down through generations. "What we're creating here is a living library of human knowledge," Alex explained as he calibrated cameras for another recording session. "These techniques have been preserved through apprenticeship for thousands of years, but digital technology allows us to document and share them at scale while maintaining the nuanced detail that makes traditional teaching so effective." The virtual reality programs had attracted funding from technology companies interested in cultural preservation applications. Microsoft had provided equipment and technical support, while Google had featured the project in their arts and culture platform, giving the workshop global visibility that translated into increased visitor interest and educational partnerships. International museums had begun licensing the virtual reality content for their own educational programming, creating revenue streams that supported expanded workshop operations, while spreading knowledge of traditional techniques to audiences that could never visit Millbrook Heights in person. The Smithsonian Institution had been the first major museum to incorporate the VR programs into their permanent exhibitions, validating the educational value of the innovative documentation approach. The digital archive had also preserved Marcus Whitfield's techniques through interviews with elderly craftspeople who had worked with him during his most productive years. These oral histories, combined with analysis of his surviving sculptures, had created unprecedented documentation of his artistic methods that enriched understanding of both his individual contributions and the broader traditions he had represented. The workshop's influence on regional tourism had transformed Millbrook Heights into a legitimate cultural destination that appeared in travel guides and attracted organized tour groups. The city's tourism board had developed specialized cultural heritage tours that included the workshop alongside other historical sites, creating economic benefits that extended throughout the metropolitan area. Hotel occupancy rates in the region showed measurable increases during workshop events and exhibitions, while restaurants and attractions reported visitor spending that could be directly attributed to cultural programming. The economic impact studies had provided concrete evidence that grassroots cultural development could generate significant financial returns for entire communities. The success had inspired the creation of the National Community Arts Network, an organization dedicated to replicating the Millbrook Heights model in other locations. Williams served on the advisory board, helping communities develop their own versions of resident artist programs that honored local traditions while fostering contemporary creativity. The network had facilitated the establishment of similar workshops in 12 cities across the United States, each adapted to reflect local cultural resources and community needs. A blacksmithing workshop in Montana, a pottery collective in North Carolina, and a textile arts center in New Mexico had all drawn inspiration from the Marcus Whitfield Memorial Workshop while developing their own distinctive programming and community relationships. The beauty of this model is its adaptability, observed Dr. Patricia Williams, the network's executive director. The specific art form matters less than the commitment to community engagement, historical awareness, and educational accessibility. Williams' example provides a framework that communities can modify to support whatever creative traditions they want to preserve and develop. The network's annual conference had become a significant gathering for community arts advocates, attracting participants from around the world who were working to establish similar programs in their own locations. Williams' keynote presentations at these events had established him as a thought leader in community-based cultural development, leading to consulting opportunities and speaking engagements that further expanded his influence. The workshop's research, Partnerships had generated academic publications that contributed to scholarly understanding of community arts programming, traditional craft preservation, and the social impacts of cultural initiatives. William had co-authored papers with sociologists, art historians, and urban planners, translating practical experience into theoretical frameworks that could guide future policy and programming decisions. The peer-reviewed publications had enhanced the workshop's credibility within academic circles, leading to additional research collaborations and grant opportunities. Universities competed to place graduate students in research positions at the workshop, creating a pipeline of young scholars who were documenting and analyzing the community's ongoing transformation. The workshop's influence on local politics had been subtle but significant, with neighborhood residents becoming more engaged in civic activities and municipal decision-making processes. Voter turnout in Millbrook Heights had increased substantially since the workshop's establishment, while residents regularly attended city council meetings to advocate for policies supporting cultural programming and historic preservation. Several workshop participants had successfully run for local office, bringing arts-friendly perspectives to municipal government. Charlotte Morrison had been elected to the school board, where she championed expanded arts education funding, while Henry Morrison served on the Planning Commission, where he advocated for zoning policies that supported creative businesses while protecting neighborhood character. The political engagement had created a model for how cultural programming could strengthen democratic participation by giving community members shared experiences and common interests that motivated civic involvement. Political scientists had begun studying Millbrook Heights as an example of how arts initiatives could address social fragmentation and civic disengagement that affected many American communities. The workshop's approach to conflict resolution had attracted attention from mediation professionals and community organizers working in areas where artistic activities had generated tensions similar to those William had initially experienced. His transformation from neighborhood nuisance to community leader provided practical insights into how patient dialogue and mutual education could resolve disputes while creating lasting positive relationships. Training programs for community. Mediators now included case studies of the Millbrook Heights experience, teaching conflict resolution professionals how cultural misunderstandings could be addressed through education and inclusive programming rather than legal enforcement or compromise solutions that satisfied no one completely. The success had generated unexpected challenges related to managing fame and recognition, while maintaining the authentic community relationships that had made success possible. William had learned to balance media attention and professional opportunities with his commitments to neighbors and students, developing skills in boundary setting and priority management that were as crucial as sculptural techniques. The demands of representing not just his own artistic career, but an entire model of community development had required William to develop public speaking abilities, media relations skills, and organizational leadership capabilities that he'd never needed. As a solitary artist, the learning curve had been steep, but community support had made the transition manageable while preserving his core identity as a practicing sculptor. The workshop's financial sustainability had evolved to include diverse revenue streams that reduced dependence on any single source of support. Sculpture sales, educational programming fees, consultation income, and licensing revenues from digital content had created a robust economic foundation that could weather fluctuations in any individual area. The financial model had been studied by nonprofit organizations and social enterprises seeking to develop sustainable funding approaches for community programming. The combination of earned revenue, grant funding, and community investment had proven more resilient than traditional arts funding models that relied primarily on donations or government support. The workshop's influence on property development had extended beyond simple value increases to include conscious efforts to maintain neighborhood affordability and character. Developers working in Millbrook Heights had adopted design standards that reflected the area's cultural identity, while ensuring that new construction complemented rather than overwhelmed existing architectural and social environments. The approach had prevented the displacement and cultural erasure that often accompanied rapid property value increases in neighborhoods experiencing cultural renaissance. Long-term residents had benefited from increased home values while maintaining their community connections and cultural investments. The workshop's contribution to mental health and social wellness had been documented through partnerships with local healthcare providers and social service organizations. Participants regularly reported improvements in mood, social connection, and sense of purpose that extended well beyond their time in sculptural activities. The therapeutic benefits had attracted attention from mental health professionals seeking creative approaches to addressing depression, anxiety, and social isolation. The workshop's model of combining skill development, community engagement, and creative expression had proven particularly effective for older adults and individuals recovering from major life transitions. Support groups for various populations had begun meeting at the workshop, using creative activities as frameworks for peer connection and mutual support. A veterans group met monthly to work on collaborative sculptures while processing military experiences, while a grief support group found comfort in creating memorial pieces that honored lost loved ones. The workshop's influence on environmental consciousness had expanded beyond sustainable practices to include educational programming about the relationships between natural resources and artistic creation. Students learned about geological processes that created the stones they carved, while developing appreciation for the environmental impacts of their creative choices. Environmental education has attracted support from conservation organizations interested in fostering deeper connections between human creativity and natural systems. The workshop had become a demonstration site for sustainable arts practices that minimize ecological impact while maintaining artistic quality and educational effectiveness. Climate change implications had become part of the workshop's educational curriculum, with students learning about how changing weather patterns might affect stone quarrying, transportation costs, and the longevity of outdoor sculptures. The discussions had fostered broader environmental awareness that participants carried into other aspects of their lives. The workshop's documentation of traditional techniques had attracted attention from anthropologists and cultural preservationists, working to maintain endangered craft knowledge in other parts of the world. The digital archive had become a resource for communities seeking to revitalize their own traditional arts practices after periods of disruption or neglect. International collaborations had emerged with indigenous communities, traditional craft, organizations, and cultural preservation initiatives that shared similar goals of maintaining historical knowledge while adapting it for contemporary relevance. The workshop had become a model for how traditional skills could be preserved and transmitted without being frozen in historical recreations. The intergenerational knowledge transfer that occurred daily at the workshop had created lasting relationships between participants of different ages and backgrounds. Teenagers worked alongside retirees, sharing perspectives and learning from each other in ways that strengthened community bonds while advancing individual artistic development. The age diversity had enhanced learning for all participants, with younger students bringing technological perspectives and creative risk-taking that challenged older participants, while experienced adults provided patience, life wisdom, and historical context that enriched everyone's understanding of their work's significance. The workshop's influence on career development had extended far beyond William's own professional transformation, to include numerous participants who had discovered new career paths through their involvement in sculptural activities. Several students had enrolled in art schools, while others had started small businesses related to crafts, tourism, or creative services. The economic multiplier effects had created employment opportunities that ranged from direct arts instruction to supporting services like transportation, hospitality, and retail. The workshop had become an economic development engine that demonstrated how cultural programming could generate jobs and business opportunities while preserving community character. As William prepared for the 10th anniversary celebration of his first neighborhood presentation, he marveled at the exponential growth of impact that had emerged from what began as a simple desire to pursue creative fulfillment during a period of career uncertainty. The workshop had evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined, becoming a catalyst for transformation that had touched thousands of lives while creating a replicable model for community cultural development. The anniversary event would feature not just local celebration, but international recognition, with delegations from communities around the world coming to study the workshop's methods and achievements. The gathering would include policymakers, educators, artists, and community organizers who were working to establish similar programs in their own locations. The sounds of creation that had once disturbed his neighbors now resonated across continents, inspiring communities to discover their own potential for cultural innovation and collaborative achievement. The workshop had proven that individual passion, combined with community support and historical awareness, could create resources that served not just local needs, but global aspirations for more connected, creative, and culturally vibrant societies. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.